In the 1960s, while the eyes of the world were turned upward toward the moon, a smaller but equally passionate group of visionaries was looking down into the abyss. This was the era of inner space, a time when serious scientists, military strategists, and architects believed that the colonization of the continental shelves was not just possible, but inevitable. Led by the charismatic Jacques Cousteau, the world was promised a future where humanity would evolve into Homo Aquaticus, a species that would live, work, and play on the ocean floor. They envisioned sprawling, pressurized cities under glass domes, underwater farms harvesting kelp and plankton, and miners extracting mineral wealth from the seabed. It was a vision of limitless expansion for a crowded planet. Yet today, the ocean floor remains as desolate as the surface of Mars. There are no cities, no underwater highways, no colonies. The dream of the underwater metropolis is a vanished grandeur that drowned under the crushing weight of economic reality, physiological danger, and the arrival of robotics. The ruins of these first habitats now rust silently in the darkness, monuments to a future that was forbidden by the biological limits of the human body.
The physical evidence of this era is haunting. Off the coast of Sudan, the remains of Cousteau's Starfish House still sit on the reef, overgrown by coral, looking like a crashed spaceship from a retro future. In the archives of the U.S. Navy, the blueprints for Sealab tell a story of Cold War ambition, where Aquanauts were trained to live for weeks at high pressure, speaking in squeaky, helium-induced voices, fighting the cold and the darkness. These projects were not science fiction. They were fully funded, operational experiments. Men lived there. They cooked meals, smoked cigarettes, and conducted research while fish swam past their windows. But the dream ended abruptly. The death of Aquanaut Barry Cannon in 1969 during the Sealab 3 mission was the Challenger disaster of the underwater world, a tragic breaking point that caused the military and the government to withdraw funding. The architectural proscription here was self-imposed. We realized that the ocean was not a new frontier to be lived in, but a hostile environment to be visited only by machines.
Welcome back to Vanished Grandeur, where we explore the utopian dreams that reality dismantled. To understand why these cities were planned, we must understand the breakthrough technology of the 1950s, saturation diving. Developed by Dr. George Bond, this medical theory proved that after a certain time under pressure, the human body's tissues become fully saturated with inert gas, like nitrogen or helium. Once saturated, a diver could stay down indefinitely, days, weeks, or months, without accumulating any more decompression debt. They only had to decompress once at the very end of their stay. This was the key that unlocked the door to the underwater city. Suddenly, the commute from the surface was unnecessary. You could build a house on the bottom, pressurize it to match the water depth, and live there. This physiological loophole sparked a gold rush of architectural design. Architects began designing villages with garages for mini-subs, underwater scooter paths, and nuclear reactors for power. It was the Wild West of hydro-architecture.
The push for underwater cities was driven by the same engine that drove the space race, the Cold War. Both the USA and the USSR feared that the other would weaponize the seabed. The ocean floor was seen as the ultimate high ground for placing nuclear missile silos hidden from satellite detection. Control of the continental shelf meant control of the world's resources. This military imperative flushed millions of dollars into projects like the U.S. Navy's Sealab program and the Tektite project. The underwater city wasn't just a hippie dream of living with dolphins, it was a strategic necessity. The vision was of military garrisons on the seabed, manned by elite troops who would patrol the depths. However, this militarization of the seabed was eventually forbidden by international treaties, the Seabed Arms Control Treaty of 1971, which removed the primary financial incentive for building these massive subaquatic fortresses, leaving the concept stranded without a patron.
Jacques Cousteau's Conshelf, or Continental Shelf, II experiment in 1963 remains the most iconic image of this era. Located in the Red Sea, it was a true underwater village.
The main habitat, the Starfish House, had a central hub with radiating arms containing sleeping quarters, a laboratory, and a kitchen. There was a separate deep cabin for 2 men at 30 meters, and a garage for the famous diving saucer submarine. The architecture was deliberately futuristic, with large portholes and bright yellow paint. Cousteau lived there for a month with his team, and a parent named Claude. They drank wine, played chess, and proved that life could be normal under the sea. The footage from his documentary, World Without Sun, captivated the globe. It sold the idea that the underwater life was glamorous, hiding the reality of the constant humidity, the skin infections, and the psychological strain of living in a tin can where the sun never rises.
In stark contrast to Cousteau's cinematic flair, the U.S. Navy Sealab program was industrial and gritty. Sealab 1, 1964, and Sealab 2, 1965, were essentially steel cylinders dropped off the coast of California. Sealab 2 was nicknamed the Thailand Hilton, after project leader Scott Carpenter. It sat at a depth of 62 meters, 205 feet, in cold, murky water. The Aquanauts lived in a high helium atmosphere to prevent nitrogen narcosis. The helium had a bizarre side effect. It made everyone sound like Donald Duck. The Donald Duck effect was funny for the cameras, but dangerous for operations. In an emergency, shouting commands was impossible because no one could understand the high-pitched gibberish. Communications had to be typed. This architectural environment was isolating. The men were physically on Earth, but linguistically and atmospherically cut off from humanity. The grandeur here was purely survivalist.
The dream crashed in 1969 with Sealab 3. The habitat was refurbished and lowered to a much greater depth of 185 meters, 610 feet, off San Clemente Island. The technological leap was too great. The habitat leaked helium, the heating systems failed, and the divers were freezing. During a repair mission, Aquanaut Barry Cannon died of carbon dioxide poisoning due to a faulty rebreather scrubbing canister. His death shocked the Navy. It revealed that the margin for error in underwater living was non-existent. Unlike space, where a vacuum kills you instantly, the ocean kills you slowly, with cold, pressure, and gas imbalances. The investigation that followed led to the cancellation of the habitat program. The architecture of Sealab 3 was hauled up and eventually scrapped. The Navy decided it was cheaper and safer to send robots than to build cities for men who sounded like ducks and died from breathing.
While the military backed away, NASA stepped in with Project Tektite 1969-1970 in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Tektite was less about depth and more about psychology. NASA used the underwater habitat as a simulator for long-duration space missions. They wanted to know how small crews behaved in isolation. Tektite 2 famously featured an all-female team of Aquanauts led by Sylvia Earle. The habitat was white and stark, sitting in shallow, clear water. The scientists lived there for weeks, but the focus had shifted. They weren't there to colonize the ocean, they were there to study themselves. The underwater city had become a mere laboratory, a testbed for a different frontier. This marked the end of the end. The ocean was no longer the destination. It was just a training ground for the stars. Parallel to the Western efforts, Japan's metabolist architects, led by Kiyonori Kikutake, proposed massive floating and underwater structures. The Marine City Project, 1958 to 1963, envisioned giant floating towers with underwater living units that would dangle like pods into the depths. These were not just scientific outposts, they were proposed solutions to Tokyo's overpopulation. The designs were breathtakingly ambitious, megastructures that would harvest the ocean's energy and food. However, like Tatlin's Tower, these remained paper architecture. The economic boom of the 1960s allowed Japan to expand its land-based cities through reclamation, artificial islands, rather than colonization of the deep. It turned out to be infinitely cheaper to dump dirt into the bay than to build pressurized steel condos underwater. Ultimately, the underwater city was forbidden by economics. The primary justification for these habitats was support for the offshore oil and gas industry. It was thought that divers living on the seabed would be needed to maintain wellheads.
But in the 1970s and 80s, the technology of ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, advanced rapidly. A robot didn't need to breathe, didn't get cold, didn't need food, and didn't demand hazard pay. The oil companies realized they didn't need a city, they needed a joystick. The entire economic model for the underwater colony evaporated. The habitats that were built were decommissioned or sunk as artificial reefs. The grandeur of the vision was replaced by the pragmatic efficiency of the unmanned drone.
A few small habitats survived the call. The Hydrolab, operated by NOAA, hosted hundreds of missions in the 70s and 80s, but was eventually retired to the Smithsonian Museum. The only remaining operational underwater laboratory in the world today is Aquarius Reef Base in the Florida Keys. It is a tiny, bus-sized module, a far cry from the sprawling cities Cousteau promised. It struggles constantly for funding, frequently on the chopping block. It serves as a lonely outpost, the last flicker of the great 1960s dream. Its existence is precarious, a reminder of how difficult it is to maintain even the smallest human foothold in the hydrospace. We also learned that the human body hates saturation diving. Long-term exposure to high pressure can cause dysbaric osteonecrosis, essentially the rotting of the bones. The gas bubbles can block small blood vessels in the bone marrow, causing the bone tissue to die, especially in the hips and shoulders. This silent, crippling disease plagued many early aquanauts. The ocean didn't just resist our architecture, it attacked our anatomy. This medical reality served as a biological ban on permanent underwater living. We can visit, but we cannot stay without paying a terrible physical price. While the real cities vanished, the fictional ones thrived. The 1960s underwater craze gave us James Bond and Thunderball, battling spear gun-wielding divers. Decades later, James Cameron, an avid ocean explorer, gave us The Abyss, a movie that essentially reconstructed the Sealab aesthetic with high-tech grit. These cultural artifacts kept the dream alive in the public imagination long after the funding had dried up. They perpetuated the myth that the underwater city was just around the corner, masking the reality that the door had already been slammed shut by the Navy and the oil industry.
There is a kitsch legacy to this era, the Jules Undersea Lodge in Key Largo, Florida. Originally a research habitat called La Chalupa, it was converted into a hotel where guests have to scuba dive to enter their room. It is a novelty, a tourist attraction, where you can order a pizza delivery, brought in a watertight case. While fun, it is a humiliating demotion for a technology that was meant to save the world. The architecture that was designed to be the vanguard of human evolution is now a honeymoon suite for adventurous tourists. It is vanished grandeur, commodified into a quirky Airbnb. The comparison with space exploration is telling. We have a permanently manned International Space Station, ISS, but no International Ocean Station. Space is a vacuum, which is actually easier to engineer for than the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. 10 meters of water equals 1 additional atmosphere of pressure. At the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the pressure is over 1,000 atmospheres. Architectural structures in space need to hold air in. Underwater structures need to keep the ocean out. The structural engineering required for underwater cities is exponentially heavier and more expensive per cubic meter than space stations. We chose the stars because the ocean was simply too heavy to lift.
Modern visions of ocean colonization have shifted from the sea floor to the sea surface. Concepts like seasteading or the oceanic city propose floating platforms that rise with the sea levels. This acknowledges the failure of the 1960s dream. We have abandoned the idea of Homo Aquaticus living in the dark pressure. We have accepted that we are surface dwellers. The underwater city is now considered a technological dead end, a retro-futurist fantasy that belongs in the same category as the flying car, a future that we realized we didn't actually need or want.
The 1960s dream of underwater cities was a unique moment of technological optimism, fueled by Cold War paranoia and the belief that humanity could conquer any environment. Projects like Conshelf and Sealab proved that we could live underwater, but they failed to answer why we should. The combination of lethal physiology, massive expense, and the efficiency of robotics issued a permanent prescription on the colonization of the continental shelf. The Aquanauts were heroes of a frontier that closed before it truly opened.
The physical remnants of this era are vanishing. The steel hulls of the habitats left on the seafloor are slowly corroding, turning into artificial reefs. Conshelf II is now more coral than metal. The architecture is being literally consumed by the life it sought to study. This is the ultimate reclamation. The ocean does not tolerate permanent visitors. The vanished grandeur of the underwater city is a testament to the planet's resistance to human expansionism.
We often lament that we know more about the surface of Mars than the bottom of our own ocean. The failure of the underwater city projects is a major reason why. When we pulled the plug on Sealab, we stopped looking with human eyes. We outsourced our curiosity to cameras and sensors. The dream of waking up to a view of a coral reef outside your bedroom window remains one of the most romantic and persistent visions of the future. But for now, it remains strictly forbidden by the laws of physics and finance. The rusting skeletons of the Conshelf and Sealab habitats lie in the dark, silent monuments to a time when we believed we could become a water-breathing species. If you were mesmerized by this deep dive into inner space and the failed colonization of our own planet, be sure to subscribe to Vanished Grandeur and share your thoughts. Would you volunteer to live in an underwater city, or is the claustrophobia too much? Our next episode rises from the depths to the absolute heights of urban ambition. City in the Sky, Le Corbusier's unrealized dream. We will explore the radical, vertical concepts of the Ville Radieuse, plans that proposed razing historic Paris to build giant cruciform towers in a park, a vision that was fortunately banned but fundamentally changed how we build cities today. What other extreme architectural visions have shaped our world? Let us know in the comments.